Chapter 2. James and Barbara made their way along the path, crossed a two-plank footbridge and the grassy banks of a wide dyke, stepped onto a narrow lane and walked the strip of concrete to James's house. It was surrounded by a wall of wind-tussled conifers that formed a huge rectangle. It was the only break along the otherwise monotonous road edge. It stuck out north like a flag flying at half-mast. Poking above the trees, Barbara could see the spiked glass tower gleaming in the sun. She turned to say something to James, but her words were interrupted as a distant, hidden cacophony of screams and thunder rumbled from beyond the house. She stared at James for a moment. "The theme park never took over? Just moved in next door?" "Not quite next door. There's a car park in the way. It's not as much fun as you might think." "I didn't think it would be fun at all." James smiled. "This is me," he said, as they passed the corner of the conifers. The entrance was wide enough for 2 cars. Barbara could just about make out the words Ivy Arch on the once grand iron gates that made a rusty tunnel of the first few metres of the driveway. Tilda ran on ahead, disappeared through the gap in the trees, and then ran back again, delighted. Barbara paused in the open gateway. Ivy Arch was set back about 25 metres from the road. A scruffy, sparsely gravelled driveway split an unkempt front garden in two and led to a strange building that was more a discrepancy than a house. A pair of round windows stared out from above an archway that held together 2 very different structures. On the left was a regular would-be detached house, as unremarkable as it was solid. On the right a fat tower, a full story taller than the house and the arch. There were no windows in the ground or first floors, just an expanse of dark brick broken by a shining steel ladder. A metal gantry ringed a glazed framework of steel rising up to form the second floor and conical roof, finally finishing in a steel spike that drove into the clear blue sky. Its dark body and glaring top made it look like a rotten ice cream cornet. James didn't notice straight away that Barbara had stopped because he was watching Tilda. She capered. He'd never seen her caper. When he realised he was alone, he turned to Barbara. "What's wrong?" he said, walking back to her. She looked at him, and James stared back blankly. Any attempt to read her face was like deciphering a soapy letter that had been held under a tap in an effort to rinse it. "I remember coming here for a party when I was 15. It wasn't so creepy then." She gestured at the dark moor of the archway and the 2 round windows above. "Well, the ivy hadn't quite died yet," said James. He was a little concerned that Barbara had described his house as creepy. "I suppose the white lightning must have helped. The best medicine a 15-year-old could get." "You live here alone?" "Yes." "Here?" "Yes." James was getting flustered, the earlier ease going. "Is there something wrong?" Barbara's gaze flicked between the watching arch and James, his face so open and innocent and ready. "Well," she sought the right words. "There's not enough crows." James laughed. "I suppose it is a bit freaky," he admitted. "But it won't bite." He smiled. There was a lot of hope in that smile. Barbara eyed the archway, still 20 metres away. It glowered. They both jumped as Tilda barked and reared onto her back legs. Then she sprinted towards the house, covering the distance in a few quick seconds, gravel and baked dust thrown up in her wake. She was still barking as she entered the archway and disappeared. Then Tilda fell silent. Barbara watched the shadow of the archway intently, searching and waiting for any sign of the black and brown dog. And then she was back in the light, sprinting toward them, head down, a sleek, hirsute machine. Barbara let out a breath she hadn't realised she'd been holding. Tilda was back with them in a crash and splash of dust and gravel. She danced around Barbara, tongue lolling. James smiled hopefully at Barbara and eyed the dog suspiciously, wondering if all this strange behaviour meant a trip to the vet. The suspicion ran deep, all the way to his wallet. Barbara was assuaged by Tilda's excitement and by James's obvious openness. He had a trust that was almost infectious. As the 4-legged friend turned into a brown and black blur of hair once again, Barbara set off down the drive. My, that's an impressive shaft you have," she said, looking up at the spike. Barbara didn't usually bother with innuendo. Her best friend, Diane, was always way ahead of her, but she couldn't resist it. "Yeah," said James, completely missing it anyway. He was blind to anything sexual at the moment. His mind had an automatic defence system. If he allowed himself to think such thoughts, then he wouldn't be able to speak. They put it up in the mid-90s. Barbara laughed and raised her eyebrows. James just smiled the same smile. "Who did?" said Barbara, letting the double entendre fall into the gravel. "My parents. Well, the builders. Something to do with subsidence." Subsidence? Barbara was pleased that it was such a mundane problem. It added a desperately needed normality to the house. Something like that, yeah. "I don't remember much of that party." "That'll be the White Lightning." Barbara laughed. "Did we get in there?" she said, pausing and looking up and nodding at the tower. "No, it was all locked up back then. My parents only just started using it after the spike was fitted. Probably not safe before then." "Probably not. It was my granddad's place, really. He used to work for the government way back." "Doing what?" "Not sure. Something medical, I think. Making another Frankenstein." James laughed, and didn't even think to try to correct her on the common mix-up between doctor and monster. Barbara took as close a look as she could at the front gardens. At one time, she could tell, they had been well tended. There was a sort of order to the chaos. The overgrown plants and weeds were a mess, but they were patches of mess. On the left, under the blank gaze of the oh-so-ordinary house, was the main tumult of vegetation. Barbara could see many trees, plants, and flowers she could identify, and many more she couldn't. They were all choked by the strangling weeds. The right, under the glare of the tower, was an incredibly green, incredibly lush lawn. Here she could tell that James had had a go. The lawn had at least been mowed in the last week. A ride-on mower, idle now, was there to prove it. It wasn't a particularly complicated garden, and Barbara could see that it could be fairly low maintenance. It was only lassitude that had seen it become a jungle. She noticed a swing hanging from the tree closest to the front of the house. It was watched by the windows, which were dirty and gloomy, their curtains drawn, the sun barely reflecting off the dingy glass. Setting off again, they approached the archway. The midday sun made sure that it wasn't as dark as it had looked, and Barbara was quite glad to enter the shadow, as it meant she was no longer being watched by those circular windows above. The archway stretched back far enough to be a tunnel, and Tilda's eager woofs and pants echoed in a "there is something alive in here" kind of way. James carried on, unimpressed. Breaking through to the other side, the driveway opened up into a large, once gravel circle. And beyond that, the back garden spread itself even bigger and messier than the front. Skulking in the shadow of the large tower was a smaller, single-story mini-tower with no window or door, and a large, funnel-like chimney pierced the centre of the tiled conical roof. A huge breeze-block garage stretched all the way to the rampant plant life of the back garden. It was large enough to have two double garage doors, both of which were firmly closed, and the furthest would remain so. A strong plant life had crept around the side and down from the roof and strapped it shut. The vegetation looked to be trying to pull down the modern, ugly building that stood out so from its older surrounding. On the left was welcome normality, and so even with the grubby windows it was homely. At least the curtains are open, thought Barbara. The rear entrance was through a ground-floor extension that was set back halfway along the normal side of the house and stretched back 12 metres or so, creating a large, L-shaped shaded courtyard that was dotted with shrinking puddles that still hadn't dried. Beyond the extension was a row of wooden sheds that was solid and well maintained. For now, Barbara couldn't help but add. Beyond the circle the sun glared at the huge garden, at least twice the size of the front. The whole area was in turmoil, a stormy green ocean, heaving and pulsing, swelling higher and denser as it approached, and then broke onto the back row of conifers. It was a tidal wave of vegetation, which, if left unchecked, would soon be ready to swallow the whole house. Barbara stared, wide-eyed. James noticed her incredulity. "Needs a little work," he admitted with a smile. "Are you coming in?" Tilda seconded the invitation. She acquiesced. She threw one last glance at the sun-bathed mess. She thought that it looked as though the trees at the back were playing catch-up with those closer to the house. She dismissed the thought, thinking it pointless to ask, and followed James and Tilda into the house. After a small entrance porch, they entered a large, well-appointed, well-kept, modern kitchen. Barbara was shocked, even stunned. It was so bright in here. She hadn't noticed the skylights in the extension's roof. Artificial lights flickered on automatically. They were under every wall cupboard and in the ceiling, so that while it was bright and white, there was nowhere a glare. Barbara felt self-conscious in her dusty boots. James hadn't bothered to remove his, so she'd kept hers on, and with her snotty hay fever and grubby hands, she didn't dare touch anything. "Is there somewhere I can have a quick wash?" she pleaded to James. "Back through the porch. There's a sink in the toilet," he said. "Tea or coffee?" "Tea, please." She fled to the toilet. Tilda watched Barbara leave, Her tongue hung low and flapped as she panted. She switched her gaze to James. "What?" he asked as he moved to the sink with the kettle, ready to fill it. Tilda continued to stare. Inwardly she sighed. He wasn't a bad master. It was just that he wasn't very thoughtful. She put a little more heat into the stare. "What?" he repeated, as he took the now full kettle back to its base and flicked the power on. Had Tilda been able to formulate words in her own mind, they'd go something like this. "It's every time we go out. He must notice that it's hot, that I'm hot, and the heat makes things outside dry. So why can't he ever remember that it makes me dry? Get me a drink of water, you idiot. I suppose I have to wait the usual 2 hours before he even thinks about it, and then another 2 hours before he remembers. Dick. I'll probably die of dehydration in the 3rd hour, which might knock it down to 3.5 hours before he remembers." And so on. James busied himself with the teapot, oblivious to the silent canine accusations. Barbara returned to the kitchen. She was still a mess, but a much relieved mess. She had halted the slide of her face, giving it the static appearance of a semi-melted ice lolly which had been returned to the freezer. James beamed, feeling happy and silly that he'd been excited about her return. His beam made him look more silly than happy, but she smiled back. They stood awkwardly for a moment, before James finally invited Barbara to sit down. She smiled in relief, and moved to a chair at the huge wooden table in the centre of the room. As she covered the short distance, she noticed the panting Tilda. "Doesn't she want a drink?" she said to James. He stared at her, then at the dog. Whoops. He rushed to the sink, grabbed the steel bowl, filled it, and placed it on the floor, with what he hoped was a practised "I always give the dog a drink" flourish. "I love you," Tilda would have thought, as she looked to Barbara before moving to the bowl. "This is amazing," said Barbara, gazing around the kitchen. "Yeah, my dad liked a good kitchen," James replied, passing Barbara a mug of tea. He sat down opposite her at the table. Silence descended. Barbara sipped her tea, happy to just recover. James shifted and fidgeted, the solid wood of the table a barrier between them. He smiled and he smiled, feeling so awkward that he felt he might crack. "Lunch!" he very nearly shouted. "Do you want some lunch?" Okay." He leapt up and busied himself. "What are we having?" "Salad with bacon." He grabbed a saucepan, filled it with water, and placed it on the hob. The gas ring fired into life. He relaxed and moved around his kitchen with ease. He bustled, he hummed, and he even threw titbits to Tilda. "So, what did you do after school?" he called out to Barbara over the sizzle of the bacon in the pan. "I didn't imagine you would stay around here." "College, and then I tried university. I went to Leeds, but it didn't work out. Since then I've moved about a lot," Barbara replied. "Are you just visiting then?" he asked while chopping a red and yellow pepper. "No, back to stay. I decided to settle and couldn't think where. Then my grandma died. Sorry, that's okay. And left me her house in Barton. Made the decision for me. How about you? Did you just stay here?" "No," said James. "My mum died 6 months ago." "Oh, I'm sorry." "And then my dad 2 months ago," he finished. Barbara stared. "Oh," she said out loud. "Yeah." Barbara had no idea what to say. "There's a lot of that around." "Yeah. My parents are far from the only ones. Unlucky to lose both, though. I saw there was another man dead the other day. He was walking across the Humber Bridge and just collapsed." "Yeah, that's the same as my mum. Just collapsed, I mean. She wasn't walking the bridge. She was in this kitchen, actually." He poured pasta into the pan of boiling water. "Oh." Barbara shifted in her seat. "So your dad didn't collapse?" "No," said James. "He was electrocuted." "What, on a fence or something?" "No, that happened in the house. Kind of hard to explain." Barbara didn't press for details. "What about your parents?" "Not much to say." Barbara was glad to change the subject. "We were never close, and when Gran left me the house, that was the final straw for Mum." Barbara shrugged. "Unlucky to lose both," said James. Barbara shrugged again. "Anyway," James continued, "I didn't come back here to live till 3 months ago. I moved to Grimsby when I was 18. It was going to be a stepping stone to bigger and better things. I was going to move on, but—" He paused while he scraped the bacon out of the pan onto a plate to cool. "I never did. I just sort of got stuck there." "Why's that?" "It was too easy not to move on, I suppose." There was a pause as Barbara studied her host. James busied himself with the lunch and pretended not to notice. "Still, at least I didn't have anything special to give up to come look after Tilda," he said with a smile. "Every cloud has a silver lining, eh?" James nodded as he mixed the salad. How does a girl who went from Barton to Barton end up in a field covered in snot? Barbara laughed. The doctor told me to get some fresh air. Told me it'd do me some good. Doctors, eh? What do they know? I didn't tell him about my hay fever. Why not? He said, as he chopped basil leaves. I forgot. Well, next time I'll swoop in with all the pills, sprays and inhalers you can think of, chuck you in one of those sealed bubbles and shake, rattle and roll you wherever you want to go. Barbara laughed. James squeezed salad cream and mayonnaise into the bowl with a flourish, and then attacked the mixture with a fork. Is that full-fat salad cream and mayo? Said Barbara, eyeing the colours of the labels on the bottles. It is. Would I be very boring if I told you I'm excited? Hang on tight, James replied, smiling. Barbara was laughing again. I like your smile, he said. Thank you. You never smile much at school. No, she said, and, seeing James's discomfort at her short answer, added, I never really liked school. Full of kids. They both laughed. I'm just happier being a grown-up, I suppose. James drained the pasta and cooled it onto the cold tap before adding it to the bowl. He scraped the bacon on top of the pasta and gave the whole thing one last rigorous stir. Their lunch prepared, he returned to the table and sat opposite her, the dense wood now a bridge. You're not a vegetarian, are you? He asked, too late. No, it's okay. They tucked into their lunch. Barbara nodded, waving her fork at the meal. James smiled and nodded back. So what do you do? Barbara chewed for a moment. I'm a writer, she said. Yeah? Said James. What sort of stuff? Barbara chewed some more. She liked to be open about her work, but it didn't always go down very well. Still, she said to herself, he's a grown man. Erotic fiction. Oh yeah? Said James, not at all casually. Cool. Cool? He said to himself while chewing rigorously. Cool? He continued to chew, not wanting her to think that he was interested in erotic fiction, even though he was interested in her and what she did. Calm down, she willed to him. It's not a competition. It's not a game. She had had many different reactions to her work, and James's was far from the worst. Tilda looked from one to the other. Well, James scratched his head. I saw a lad with erotica on his mind today. He paused as he chewed, uncomfortable with his chosen topic. He plunged on. I say a lad, more of a young man. Probably a man, legally at least, for criminal and voting purposes, and buying beer. What are you talking about? The lad. He's maybe 18 or 19. What lad? The lad, the young man who's, No, I don't, said Barbara. He had his magazine, and his trousers were... James's voice trailed off. What? James squirmed. Young men, magazines, and secluded spots. Barbara suddenly nodded as understanding dawned. Where were his trousers? Round his ankles. Ah, embarrassing. James sighed. Yeah, I didn't know where to look. So you looked at the... James sought the right word. Smoking gun? James sighed again, nodding. Yeah, and I'm bound to see him about. I'll not know where to put my face. Well, neither will he. Stare him down and dare him to look at you. He was the one with the... Barbara's turned to seek the words. Weapon of mass seduction? I didn't know this salad came with cheese. Barbara chuckled. They laughed again and carried on with their lunch. Barbara chewed, enjoying her meal. So, what do you do to keep yourself in bacon salads and weird houses? Nothing so interesting as writing about sex. James coughed and quickly moved on. In fact, nothing. Nothing? I don't need to work, so I don't. Doesn't that get boring? Or have you got loads on? Like gardening, maybe? A wry smile played across her lips. James watched it come and go. Gardening, he mused. Yeah, gardening. Takes a lot of work to get it like that. He laughed as he leaned back in his chair. James knew that people didn't like other people not to work. They were uncomfortable with the idea that someone might be doing nothing. Fearing resentment and hoping for sympathy, James plunged on. I don't do anything. No pastimes, no hobbies, no projects. Nothing. He smiled in what he hoped was a, hey, I'm just kooky fashion. Nothing? Do films and telly count? I've just rewatched all of Twin Peaks in 3 days. Aces! Barbara gave a thumbs up. Sounds lonely, though. Yes. James knew that sympathy was about the best he could hope for. I'm okay, he replied. What about your parents? Were you close? No, he said. Yes. I don't know. We didn't talk much. Maybe the sympathy vote wasn't so good after all. He shoveled a forkful of salad into his mouth. Did you work when you lived in Grimsby? Oh, yeah, said James as he swallowed. I had lots of jobs. I worked in factories and offices. I filled up vending machines, and I drove a van for a while. Why so many? I Pretending to sleep? Barbara cocked an eyebrow. James followed it. I either slept in or slept on the job. Was it shift work, or are you narcoleptic? I looked into that, but I'm afraid that I was just... James considered his answer. Unmotivated. You mean you couldn't be asked? She laughed at his guilty look. Did you lose every job like that? Most of them. The last one was something new. What happened at the last one? Her interest was piqued. Both eyebrows were cocked. James, hesitant to explain, gave them an eye each and promptly crumbled. I was working in the offices of a shipping company in Immingham. It was a pretty normal office and the job was okay. The work was dull, but it was Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, no shift work, and the air conditioning kept me awake. My desk was next to the photocopier. It was like having a ringside seat. Every day someone went crazy at it for one reason or another. James paused while he took another bite of salad. Barbara leant forward. And? I started filming them. James filled his mouth to cover his embarrassment. Barbara stood at him while allowing him to finish. It got a little out of hand. Have you ever seen Copy Kicker? The website? Yeah, www.copykicker.co.uk. I set it up. You rotten sod. I feel really sorry for some of the poor saps on there. Well, I only started it for a bit of fun, and it wouldn't have grown so big if so many people hadn't watched. Point taken. So, did people complain about personal infringement and the like and get you sacked? No. I only ever put a couple of clips on the site. It's all the other contributions that followed that really made it massive. James took another bit of salad to work up to his admission. I was sacked because of sexual harassment. Really? What did you do? There was a girl in the office, young, attractive. Is shapely an okay term to use? Barbara nodded cautiously. I watched her struggle with the paper tray and, as always, the camera was on. And? She was bent over, jiggling about, and, well, she was wearing these white trousers. I don't know what they were made of, but they were sort of see-through. Sort of see-through? Yes. They ate for a few moments. James was embarrassed. He thought this wasn't the type of story to be telling on the first... The first what? Not a date. The first chance. But James's worries, like his life, were pointless. And did you put it on the site? She asked. No. But... Word got round the office about Copy Kicker. Most people always behaved themselves by this point, but there were a few who played up to it, especially after DIY Die. You did DIY Die? I put it on the site. I didn't do it. You know what I mean. That was the one that made the site huge, wasn't it? Pretty much. The contributions flooded in after that. I couldn't cope with it, so I passed it on to someone else, rights and all. Hang on, you didn't get the $500,000 that Google paid for it? No. Gutted? Yes. They ate in silence for a few minutes, chewing over the information. Anyway, the diaphanous trousers. Diaphanous? Said James. A good word in Erotica. It means see-through. Ah, he nodded. The management had been watching me for a while, but they didn't get round to properly checking up on me for ages, and by the time they did, I got rid of Copy Kicker, so they couldn't find anything for a disciplinary. DIY Die was too embarrassed to complain, so I thought I was pretty much in the clear. But I wasn't. The diaphanous trousers were just what the management were looking for. The girl wearing them was looking for a little bit more. She wanted her ass to be as famous as DIY Die. Could it have been? Barbara asked. It was definitely shapely. Could have been, then. I reckon so. Anyway, I told her I'd deleted it. She didn't believe me and threatened me with the management unless I gave her the video. What happened? I wouldn't give it to her, so she went back to the management. I had deleted it, but the charge stuck once DIY Die plucked up the courage to complain too. Do you think that diaphanously clad bottom could have been weighed in his direction? James just laughed as Barbara carried on in a more serious tone. Did you delete it because she complained, or because you knew that you should? I'm digging a hole for myself here, aren't I? Barbara nodded. Shall we say that it was a little bit of both and leave it at that? Barbara smiled. She scooped up the last forkful of her salad. She paused, the food halfway to her mouth. You hung out with Eddie Fiss at school? That's right. I see him sometimes, crammed into a white van. I've tried to wave, but he never seems to notice. Yeah, he's blind as a bat. He's coming to fit me a new kitchen this week. He owns his own business. I think he went a bit feudal after the splash, and got very, very protective. I've heard a few whispers of Baron Fiss. Behind his back, of course. Well, he always had a scary front, but that doesn't sound like the Eddie I knew. He always looked big and mean, but he was a softie, really. Jennifer always called him her teddy bear. She used to get him to sing that Elvis song. The song Teddy Bear? Yeah. James was tempted to try a lip curl, but he stopped just in time. Too soon for Elvis impression. impressions. Anyway, Eddie was never the lion who played too rough. I think Eddie might surprise you now. Barbara ate the last mouthful and looked thoughtfully at James. You had a thing for his girlfriend, Jennifer. James blushed like a teenager. No, not a thing. Nothing at all. Barbara smiled. She had very nice eyes. Never noticed. She would have probably looked good in a pair of white trousers. Bit creepy now. And she was very popular with the boys, right from the 3rd year. Was she? It was all a show. Never let anybody touch her. That's probably why she was with Eddie. So don't worry, you weren't the only one that never had a chance with her. Never considered it. Not once. I'm sure you didn't. They both smiled. James stood to clear the plates. I don't think we ever spoke alone at school, he said. You don't think? Yet you remember where I sat in French. All right. I know we never spoke alone. You only had eyes for Jennifer. Barbara smiled as she teased him. Still, there's time now. Barbara settled in her chair and let her head fall back, sighing with satisfaction. Without looking directly, James stared at Barbara's bare neck, the delicate lines of her throat, and the acute curve of her chin. Tilda felt the electricity in the air, and, in her way, she hoped. Barbara let her gaze drift to the skylights. Through the west window she could see the tops of the trees bordering the house and its grounds. They waved in front of a blue sliver of sky. Through the east-facing glass the imposing tower filled at least half of the vista. James returned to his seat, and she let her head fall back down. James shifted his eyes down to the table, and then glanced up again to meet her gaze. He smiled in what he hoped wasn't a guilty fashion. Got any bats in that tower? She asked. No, it's too bright, he said. They're all in the cellar. They giggled. Barbara could tell that the rest of the house was not as bright and modern as the kitchen. Through an open doorway she could see that once again the shadows prevailed. Do you want to see the tower? No, thanks. James was a little crestfallen. Barbara noticed and smiled. I've got to go. Erotica doesn't write itself, but I'll check it out next time. The question was implied, but she knew the answer, just like she knew that he'd been looking at her neck. Next time, definitely. James failed to control a grin that threatened to break his face in two. After swapping phone numbers, Barbara couldn't believe that James didn't have a mobile. Barbara stood to leave, and James went with her. In the courtyard, she looked once more to the less virile trees at the back. Are they smaller or something? She asked. They're catching up with the rest. They got damaged by the splash. The whole garden was under water, but the trees at the back took the brunt of it. Oh, yeah, of course. Did the house get flooded? No, the garden saved it. It sunk a metre or so below the level of the house. I think my parents had a bitch of a job getting it drained, though. They headed back through the arch to the little road. Tilda did a bit more capering, making James suspicious all over again. How are you getting home? He asked. My car's parked in the village. She nodded to the west. See you Friday. Can I walk you? No, thank you. And she was gone, walking confidently down the road. James watched her rear and imagined her front beginning to melt once more. Before long he heard her sneeze. The parting was observed by Dog. He was hidden at the corner of the wall of conifers. Tilda glanced around, aware of a presence even though she couldn't see anything. She moved closer to her master's legs, her head and tail lowered. James didn't notice.